My name is Tom Harley and I'm Chairman of the Menzies Research Centre, and I'd like to welcome you all here today for the launch of Variety and Choice, Good Schools for Australia by Dr Graeme Starr. Before I start, I'd like to thank Stephen Harris, the headmaster, for hosting us here today. And I hear from talking to a couple of the students that a few of you have come back early from your holidays, especially to be here for today. So thank you doubly for that. I know I couldn't get my children to do that, so this must be a very special school. And thank you for making us all so welcome. I'm going to introduce our guest speakers more fully soon, but I'd like to particularly acknowledge the presence of Barry O'Farrell, the state opposition leader and the leader of the New South Wales Liberal Party. I'd also like to welcome one of the lions of Australian liberalism, Sir John Carrick. We're very privileged to have you here, sir. It is very rare it's a rare opportunity to hear you speak, and it's a particular honour to the Menzies Research Centre that you've accepted our invitation. Thank you. Of course, Graeme Starr, Dr Graeme Starr, the author, I will also introduce a little later. Sorry, Graeme. Julian Lisa, the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, is an extraordinary, effective, prodigious and prolific director, and I'm very grateful to Julian because we wouldn't be here without him. I'd also like to welcome the local Member of Parliament, Bronwyn Bishop. I'd also like to welcome the father of the House of Representatives, that's the longest-serving member, Philip Ruddock. I'd also like to welcome the baby, Paul Fletcher, the member for Bradfield. We've got the father and the baby. I'm not sure where that leaves you, Bronwyn. I mean, I'd also like to welcome the two state MPs, Rob Stokes and Malcolm Kerr. This has been a big 12 months for the Menzies Research Centre. Today we're going to launch our fourth book for the year. That's not 2010, that's the last 12 months. The other three have all made a significant impact on policy debate, and we don't doubt that this will have a similar effect. Last January we launched Gary John's work, Aboriginal Housing in Remote Communities. It argued for the placement of new houses and support in areas where there was economic opportunity. And we note that the current federal government has subsequently been making similar noises. We'll be interested to see if they translate into action. In May, we launched Don't Leave Us with the Bill, edited, in fact, by Julian Lisa and Ryan Hadrick. It's a collection of essays providing the case against a Bill of Rights, and we see the government retreating from the bill. That book has made an outstanding contribution to that debate. In September, we launched So Many Firsts, a book about the achievement of Liberal women in Cabinet by Margaret Fitzherbert. It's pleasing to see a new generation of Liberal women making a contribution to policy both at a federal and state level. I'm certain Graeme Starr's Variety and Choice, Good Schools for All Australians, will make a similar contribution. I'll return to the book in a moment. I want to talk for a moment, if you will allow me, about this year's program for the Menzies Research Centre. We are, as most of you realise, the Liberal Party's think tank, but we look forward to making education a particular policy highlight of this year. We hope to have another book out before the end of the calendar year, and in the next couple of weeks we'll be announcing two major policy conferences dealing with important issues relating to federal policy. So watch this space. But we need your help to continue our important work. And I'd like to encourage you all to visit our website, and we can give you details of that out later, to receive information about the work we're doing, hopefully to give you an opportunity to buy our publications, buy them for yourselves, for your friends and your friends' friends, and to make any further contribution that you're able to do. Education policy has been a central tenet for Liberals. because for Liberals, education is the key provider of opportunity and individual development. The Liberal record since colonial times has been to provide high-quality public education, compulsory education, expansion of opportunities in tertiary education, and the encouragement of choice through diversity in schooling. Labour's role, on the other hand, has tended to be dictated by the teachers' unions and has consequently focused on issues of control, bureaucracy, and ideological preoccupations such as their faux class war. Its opposition and ongoing resistance to state aid seems to be based upon perhaps one of the earliest manifestations of the now common political condition, political correctness. The notion that it seems somehow wrong to provide funds to religious organisations because the state should be antiseptically secular. Liberals, at least since Menzies, have had a clear head on the matter, and I'd like to quote Sir Robert. "I had in my own student days an all-round experience, beginning in a small country state school, a larger provincial state school, a privately owned secondary school, and a great church public school in Melbourne. I have no doubt that a religious background was of the greatest education significance in the building of character. In my declining years, witnessing a world in which moral values are treated with such complete contempt in some intellectual, or more accurately, pseudo-intellectual circles, and in which the powerful influences of the press seem to be all too frequently hostile to all received standards of social behaviour, I retain my belief in the ancient virtues and values, the services which the church, schools and colleges render to them." That's from Measures of the Year. Graeme Starr's book examines the debate over government funding of non-government schools, often referred to quite simply as the state aid debate. Dr Starr reviews this debate from the First Fleet to the present day. He focuses on the attitude of politicians, educators, the churches and interest groups to explain how state aid came to be re-established in Australia and the ongoing threats to its universal application. To some, the state aid debate may seem to be of purely historical value, a debate that is over. But this is not so. It's a case study of a major political reform led by Liberals, and it exposes Labor's ongoing problems with the issue. In 2008, Julia Gillard put a bill before Parliament which demonstrated Labor's ongoing enmity towards non-government schools. It provided in the School Assistance Bill of 2008 a provision to force non-government schools to disclose the source of their donation income, to put the government hand into what is essentially private business. A disclosure regime would undoubtedly have a negative effect on the ability of non-government schools to raise funds. The mere inclusion of the provision demonstrates Labor's ongoing hostility to parental choice in education and to non-government schools in particular. At this stage, the government has promised to review the way the non-government schools are funded by 2011. The Minister has been very coy about the purpose of this review and what the funding model is that she will produce. I'd now like to call upon our host, Stephen Harris, to welcome us here today. Stephen.
Thank you, and yes, thank you for your words, and thank you for, I guess, the opportunity for us to open up Northern Beaches Christian School to the Menzies Research Centre. Just a couple of words in relation to the school. I've been teaching in the teaching business for 33 years now, and I've worked both in government schools for 14 years and in the non-government sector after the first 14 years. I'd make one comment in relation to, I guess, the politics of schooling. whenever I come back into New South Wales from having visited institutions overseas, I always have a sense of gloom. I've come, I guess, worked in an area where, regrettably, the debate has politicised schools at a grassroots level, and that's if there's any one aspect of education that I'd love, I guess, the country to get right, and that is for teachers to work together regardless of which sector they are in. The building that you're in is the Sydney Centre for Innovation and Learning, and in fact you are the first formal invited group to come into this building, so that's a real pleasure to be able to do that today. If you are interested in the building, we would love to show you around afterwards. There's a brochure we can give you as well. We have deliberately built a learning facility that we hope challenges every other school in Australia and overseas to think differently about what education can look like, can feel like, and what the outcomes might be for students. You are seated in an area called the Parklands, and we have the brain forest, the greenhouse, the glasshouse. We've gone deliberately for, I guess, different words to try and capture that what we're seeking to do here is slightly different from mainstream perceptions and what schooling might be. So as I said, you'd be very, very welcome to not only look through this building afterwards, but also we have the Marina Prior Centre. It's in its last day of rectification work going on next door, but you'll be very welcome to come through there, and I'd be very happy to show you through. Mentioned before, a thank you to the students and a great big thank you from me as principal. Interestingly today, we do have about 300 students on site, and one of the reasons for that is on our pupil-free day at the start of the year, at the start of each term, we have about 275 online students coming from all across New South Wales. Now those students are doing totally distance online courses through Skill, the Sydney Centre for Innovation and Learning. They're doing them in one of 44 courses, and we found interestingly last year, this is a real challenge to educators, that 45% of our Year 12 online students last year attained a Band 5 or a Band 6 in their results. So I think that sends an extremely interesting challenge out to all educators to work out how do you balance face-to-face with online to get the greatest strength for students. So that the students you're seeing wandering around elsewhere, they've come here for that day, and then they go off to their other schools or to their hometowns, and in some cases overseas, and continue their studies online. So for the other students who've come in today, my great big thanks for that. I won't speak anymore because today's about the book launch, but as I said beforehand, you're very, very welcome here, and we would love to show you around afterwards. And if you would like one of these little booklets about the building and all sorts of features to do with the building, the lady to see over here is Anne Knock, and she will give you one. If we haven't got enough, we'll get some more printed off for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, again for the warmth of your welcome. It's now my pleasure to introduce Barry O'Farrell, the State Liberal leader. Barry was educated in government high schools around Australia. His father was in the army, and this led to a lot of travel. He's also an alumni of an institution which he has in common with Sir John Carrick and Dr Starr. All three of them were state directors of the New South Wales Liberal Party. There is no harder or more testing school, in politics that is. He's been a terrific supporter of the Menzies Research Centre, and I'm delighted to ask Barry to launch Dr Starr's book. Barry.
John Carrick, Graeme Starr, Tom Harley, Julian Lisa, can I acknowledge the federal parliamentarians in the room, that non-traditional family of father Philip Ruddock, Earth Mother Bronwyn Bishop and baby Paul Fletcher. But importantly, can I acknowledge my colleague, the member for Pittwater, Rob Stokes, who's here also. I'm a bit concerned about this microphone, so Betty Davey, can you hear me? Yes, because I know that if Betty Davey can't hear me, at some stage during my speech you'll interrupt to tell me so. Boys and girls, can I tell you that it's always wise to listen to one's elders. Can I also say to you something about, before I talk about the book, something about this event, and that is that this book describes, as I'll go on and talk about, the role of the founder of the Liberal Party of Australia, Robert Menzies, in the state aid debate. But of course the Liberal Party of Australia is but the most recent incarnation of Liberals in government in Australia's history. In this state, the first Liberal government was in 1906 with Carruthers, who for the first time brought together the conservative side of politics into an effective political force. He was then followed at a federal level by Alfred Deakin, who happens to be the great-grandfather of Tom Harley, who is our MC here today. And I just wanted to put that historic context for you. We have the son of one of the great-grandson of one of Australia's first Prime Ministers, and we have, beside me, in John Carrick, one of the remaining links to the founder of the Liberal Party of Australia, Robert Menzies. Graeme Starr's book, Variety and Choice, Good Schools for All Australians, is a comprehensive, scholarly and welcome addition to the list of publications of the Menzies Research Centre. In just 120 pages, this book provides an historical outline of the development of non-government schools across Australia from 1788 until the present day. It explains the origins and the ensuing developments of the state aid debate, and along the way details the characters, the politicians, the religious, the villains and the heroes who are involved in that debate. For those like at least Graeme Starr, John Carrick and I who are interested in what has been described as the sublime art of politics, there's much to keep our interest in these pages, including the actions, manoeuvrings and lessons to be learned from the central figures in the state aid debates. The interest groups, from the Colonial Orangemen, the Catholic Federation, the Council of the Defence of Government Schools, the old dogs as they were called, to the Australian Parents' Council and the Australian Education Union today. The various politicians, from John Dunmore Lang and Henry Parkes in colonial times, through Menzies, Askin, Corwell and Whitlam, to more recent politicians in Malcolm Fraser, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, John Howard and Kevin Rudd. And for those of us, like me, of the Catholic persuasion, in the priests, all of whom seem to be senior priests, whether the archbishops like Paulding, Vaughan and O'Brien, who fought strongly for the principle that was involved in funding for non-government schools, Goulburn's Bishop Cullinane, who practically and skillfully politically demonstrated the illogicality of the policy as it then existed, and those like Cardinal Moran and Archbishop Carroll, who were accused of allowing partisan politics to get in the way of the principle and the objectives they were meant to be fighting for. And speaking of Archbishop Carroll, I'm surprised when I learned that the launch was to be on the Northern Beaches, that we were here at Northern Beaches Christian School, where, Mr Harris, I'm pleased to be, living as I do in an area of Sydney where so many families send their children to the beaches for education at this fine school. But of course it was at St Augustine's down in Brookvale that 3 weeks ahead of the 1972 election, Archbishop Carroll made his famous, or depending on your view, infamous, intervention into the campaign, advocating or at least allowing support of the Labor Party on the issue of state aid at that election. So whatever your perspective and interests, whether it's policy, politics or history, this is the book for you. Informative, interesting and bound to be influential. It's a credit to both its author and the publisher. Graeme Starr, of course, is a respected political scientist who brings both practical and academic perspectives to his work. Like others present, I'm particularly pleased that Graeme's taken on a task so many of us have been keenly waiting for, the biography of Sir John Carrick. Sir John, boys and girls, is one of the Liberal Party's national treasures, a Gandalf the Grey of the party of which I represent in federal parliament. Friend and an advisor of Menzies, shrewd and strategic party administrator, skillful and successful senior minister in the Fraser cabinet. John Carrick's abiding interest continues in education to this very day. Once again, in Tom Harley and Julian Lesser, we've seen demonstrated the Menzies Research Centre's superb timing for the release of this book. Just as with those previous publications that Tom spoke about, the issues canvassed in this book have again become topical. Only 10 days ago, courtesy of the Australian Education Union, we all awoke to headlines decrying the level of funding to non-government schools. In support of the claims being made on that day and in subsequent days, many of the arguments detailed in Dr Starr's treatise were again being aired. It was a reminder of both the continuing interest and passion the issue of government funding for non-government schools evokes, and the fact that for some at least the state aid debate is far from being settled. It was a reminder too for those of us who have an interest in history and facts that distortions have always been part of the debate. Once again the focus was on federal funding, ignoring the role of states in providing funding and financing for government schools, comparing the federal government's provision of aid to government schools with its funding to non-government schools, ignoring the federalist reality of government schools receiving 90% of their funds from state governments and 10% from the federal government, versus the non-government sector, which receives 15% of its funding from the state and 43% of its funding from federal sources. Leaving, of course, the gap, because the students know that that last figure doesn't add up to 100%, leaving the gap to be filled from private sources, in particular from school communities and parents. The only novelty in the latest debate on state aid was the sight and sound of the Deputy Prime Minister having to explain these federalist realities, facts that a couple of years ago she refused to acknowledge. So for Liberals, the state aid debate, and this book that details its historical twists and turns, is important because it involves matters central to our political belief system: freedom, choice, individuals and the role of government. As a Liberal, I have a clear view about the role of government. For me, the goal is to create an environment in which individuals can strive and thrive, an environment where individuals can realise the potential they have, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the wider community, where securing economic growth is not a goal in itself, but is the key to unlocking opportunities for individuals to fulfil that potential that we as Liberals know they possess. It's about building an inclusive and fair society where opportunity and choice abounds, where initiative and responsibility are encouraged, and where individual freedoms are safeguarded by government institutions that people can have trust in. And it's about the effective marshalling of government resources to provide the essential services upon which people can rely with confidence to achieve their dreams and their goals. And in all of this, the development of the individual for Liberals, education, is fundamental. So I'm unsurprised that Robert Menzies, someone who exemplified himself the benefits of education, adopted the position he did on state aid. Now, boys and girls, Robert Menzies started his schooling in a tiny school in a place called Chuparit, in a region called the Wimmera of country Victoria. And through sheer dint of hard work, he became what in those days was called a scholarship boy. He achieved a scholarship to a private college in Ballarat and then to Wesley College in Victoria. He went on to Melbourne University and excelled. And in the course of his lifetime, that education enabled him to become the top of two professions: the law, certainly the bar in Victoria and the federal bar, but also in national politics. As Dr Starr makes clear in this book, Menzies was concerned about the impact of uniformity on education. He was attracted to Montesquieu's observation that the idea of uniformity appealed to little minds, who found in it a species of perfection. Now, Menzies never claimed to be perfect. In his writings and speeches, before, during and after his Prime Ministership, he was prone to talk about himself in terms that were practical and pragmatic. And as this book confirms, Menzies had a practical federalist conviction about education, but no dogmatic attachment to states' rights. Menzies was content to take the lead in education when it was in the national interest and when it promoted the values of equity, diversity and choice. Can I just pick up a point that Stephen Harris made? One of the benefits of focusing on the purpose of education, one of the benefits of ensuring that the focus is on supporting teachers in the role they fulfil and in giving our children the keys of lifelong learning is that there is diversity within our community. There's diversity here at this school, there's diversity across the schooling system in northern Sydney, there's incredible diversity across this country. And we should not be seeking for there to be a uniform way in which that education is run, because that means that the differences that you have from your colleagues, boys and girls, will never be set alight in institutions of learning like this. In the area of education, Menzies was pragmatic in the proper sense of the word. He refused to be constrained by what he called the abstract theory or ideology, preferring instead to apply measures that would best produce a beneficial and practical outcome, understanding, as he always did, that all government decisions rested what he termed the well-being, happiness or security of individual citizens. But in my view, the importance that Menzies placed on education, the reason that he took the position he did in relation to state aid, was influenced by at least one other factor. We're all shaped by our experiences and the world and the times in which we live. So too Robert Menzies, who, before he became the first Liberal Prime Minister of Australia, lived through a Great Depression and 2 World Wars. Reading about his activities in this book on state aid again confirmed my belief that the decisions that Menzies made throughout his period in government were inextricably linked to the hopes and the dreams that he and the World War II generation that included Sparrow Force's John Carrick had for a post-war Australia. It's evident in a lesser-known passage of one of the radio broadcasts that Menzies made in this city in 1942, broadcasts that were started by his most famous, The Forgotten People, and were subsequently published in a book of that name. In a 13 November broadcast in 1942, Menzies said, "We achieve the good of man when we help and encourage him to be a man, strong, self-reliant, intelligent, independent, sympathetic and generous. This means that in the new world, we must develop all of the intelligence and strength and character in every child. Each one of them must have his chance. We must spend more on education. Lack of money must be no impediment to bright minds. To develop every human being to his fullest capacity for thought, for action, for sacrifice, for endurance is our major task, and no prejudice, stupidity, selfishness or vested interests must stand in its way." Menzies' background made it clear to him that education was to achieving those outcomes, whether overcoming prejudice, realising potential or building and developing the nation. For a man of such views, seeking to guarantee the right of every child to public support for their education, regardless of their choice of school, was a no-brainer, fitting both his personal and his party philosophy. Menzies saw support of those attending non-government schools as another example of what I term the beneficial view of government. That is, that decisions of government, public policy, that gives greater encouragement for individuals to seize the opportunity and fulfil their potential. And thankfully, the path that he pioneered has been followed by subsequent federal and state Liberal governments, which is also detailed in this book. Here in New South Wales, Askin, influenced no doubt by Ralph Honour and undoubtedly by John Carrick, took up the cause. So too, following the 1988 state election, did the Greiner government, reflected in its decisions to legislate the principles of choice and diversity in the State's Education Act and to establish a formula to guarantee to students attending non-government schools like this a per capita grant equivalent to 25% of the average cost of educating a child in a public school. It's the same road that the New South Wales Liberals and Nationals are travelling today. The principles upon which Menzies and other Liberals base their actions are timeless in their application, whether in relation to the role of government, the importance of the individual, the drivers of opportunity or the significance of education. It was evident last week when we released our plan for literacy and numeracy, committing ourselves to providing early intervention, one-on-one intensive teaching assistance to students failing or in danger of failing to meet reading, writing and maths standards, regardless of which school system they're attending. We fully accept the state's duty and obligation to educate all children. We support parents' right to make a choice of school for those children, and we acknowledge that that will involve the provision of taxpayer funds when that choice includes sending a child to a non-government school. None of that, though, means lessening our commitment to public education. As Tom Harley says in his introduction to this book, you can't have real choice if an effective alternative isn't available. And in accepting our obligation to provide quality education to all students, my New South Wales Liberals and National colleagues are determined to ensure that government education in this state is again a first choice option for those parents who want to choose it. Now, the community's embrace of the decisions taken in the 50s and 60s to almost end, I think, Graham, the state aid debate in this country is easily demonstrated. According to the latest census across New South Wales, 31% of all primary school students attend non-government schools. The figure for secondary students is 39%. That's roughly similar to the figures at a national level. In some areas, though, we see significant differences. So in the electorate of Drummoyne, the closest marginal seat that the New South Wales Liberals and Nationals are intending to win at the next election, almost half of primary school students and 2/3 of secondary school students are at non-government schools. Here in Pittwater, by contrast, Rob, the figures are 29% and 51%. Those figures provide validation, if validation is still required, of the correctness of the position taken by Menzies and those other federal and state Liberals to end the state aid debate. But its validation is also provided by parents who work hard to pay fees to send their children to schools like this and schools where fees are significantly higher. Reinforced by those parents who, like the O'Farrell family, have a foot in both camps, who use and support both public and non-government education as we seek to educate our children. And all that does to me is simply confirm again the preference for the electorate, whether state or national, for policies that are practical and focused on outcomes and meeting the needs of the community, and the public's disdain for ideologues and theorists. So, ladies and gentlemen, this book tells the story of the efforts of ordinary Australians, whether those people were the parents of students who were struggling to gain acknowledgement and support from governments over a very long time for their choice to send their children to schools like this, whether it involved those like Stephen and the teachers here who are interested in education, who don't see differences, but who simply want to unlock, as I said before, that potential that exists within every child and use the spark of schooling to do so. Whether it involved the politicians, rogues or villains, heroes or those to whom we still pay homage, who, for a variety of reasons, and believe me, Henry Parkes had most positions, sought to involve themselves in this debate, or whether they were religious or otherwise, who for reasons of Christian values and other values ascribing to other religions, were determined to demonstrate one of the freedoms that we have in this country, which is the freedom to practice a religion that we believe in. This is an important book. It's an important book that tells a story of Australians triumphing, Australians standing up for rights, standing up for freedoms, standing up for individuals, and convincing the politicians to act. It tells the story of politicians who weren't afraid to buck what at the time was regarded as political poison in making decisions based not just on what the public wanted, but on their own personal philosophy. It's a book that deserves to be read, it's a book that deserves to be influential, and it's a book that both Graeme Starr deserves credit for writing and the Menzies Research Centre for publishing.
Barry, thank you very much for the care and thought that you put into that speech. I think it shows not only the continuing interest and centrality of education and liberal thinking, but also your personal interest in the subject. Our next speaker is Dr Graeme Starr, the author. He's a political scientist. He's worked in politics and has taught government and business at several universities in Australia and overseas. He was educated at government schools in Western Sydney. He's got degrees from Sydney University, Carleton University in Canada, and Western Virginia University in the United States. He's written widely on government politics and public policy, and I think one of the best books on the history of the Liberal Party and on liberal thinking was a book he edited and compiled, which was a documentary history of the Liberal Party. He's presently working, as Barry said, on a biography of Sir John Carrick. Ladies and gentlemen, Graeme Starr.
Thank you very much, Tom. And while I'm thanking you for the fine introduction, I'd like to thank you and Julian for the Menzies Research Centre, which I think plays a part in the Liberal Party that the Liberal Party has always needed, and that is an opportunity for people in the party and around the party to tell their own story, which is something that that particular party has never done terribly well. Julian, thank you. I must thank Julian, not only been a fine director of that centre, but a heck of an editor. I've lived in fear of his telephone calls over the past year or so, as he's told me, look, you've left another darn footnote out somewhere or something like that, and it's been very good. I must thank Stephen Harris, too, for this fine institution and for letting us have the use of it. It seems to me that this does precisely what non-government schools are supposed to do, and that is to provide opportunities for innovation in education. And that's not something I've actually talked about in the book. But if we get aside from rights and needs and all those other sorts of things, one thing we should be really grateful for the non-government schools in Australia is for the opportunity they have given us to innovate in education. And of course I've got to thank Barry. Thank you, Barry. That was when they told me that Barry O'Farrell was going to launch this book, I said, well, that book's going to be well and truly launched, and I feel I feel well and truly launched now. So thank you very much. In anticipation, I'd like to thank Sir John too, because he's going to say a few words, and I know that well, I can anticipate that that's going to be something particularly special. For the benefit of you people in the front here, this will either please you or displease you, but in Australia, when we say education, we're really saying Carrick. There's probably no person around who's done more for education in Australia at all levels. That is, from university level. To get a Carrick a couple of years ago was one of the best awards that you could get in universities. Somebody changed that, but that's another story. In secondary education in this area, and making an opportunity for people to be able to come to non-government schools, we owe an awful lot to Sir John Carrick. And now that he's still under 21, he's giving a good part of his life to early childhood education, which is one of the great innovations in education at our time. Now, having left Sir John for last in those few thanks, I'd like to just say why I wrote this book, because he figures prominently in that story too. I went to see him a year or two ago, saying to tell him that I wanted to write basically a little piece. I thought it might be a little journal article or something about the state aid debate. And he said, no, don't write about the debate, tell the story. Tell the story of non-government schools and their contribution, and how there's been a wave of ups and downs throughout 200 years or more in our recognition of their place in the system. He said, if you're going to tell the story about state aid, you have to go back to 1788. And that's what I said about. So that little journal article grew some, largely thanks to Sir John. So I set about finding the story, and I found, well, it's a story of many pieces. As I started picking out all those pieces, and they're mostly there in the book, I was reminded of a story probably some of you read a long time ago, a little poem some of you read a long time ago, and some might have even read it in recent days, and if you don't, do. And that's a little poem by a fellow named John Godfrey Saxe, who hardly ever figures in anybody's books of poems, but he was the person who told us the famous legend of the 6 blind men from Indostan who were asked to describe an elephant. And being blind, they all had to describe it by touch. And I found that story, for those of you who might not read it, they came up with the idea that an elephant was an animal that had something like a snake. It was a bit like a snake because one of them touched the trunk. Another said it's a bit like a spear because he touched the tusk. Another said a bit like a fan because he touched the ear. Another said a bit like a tree because he touched the leg. Another one said it's a bit like a rope because he touched the tail. And I think one of the others said it's a bit like a wall. And so an elephant was this combination, a cross between a snake, a spear, a fan, a wall, a tree, and a rope. And that's what the story of state aid seemed to be like. It's just full of individual little pieces, and like the poem, I think the last lines in the poem said, each of them was partly right, but all of them were wrong. And that's the way the elephant came out. Well, that's the way the story looks if you only look at a little piece. The pieces go way back, as John had impressed me, way back to 1788, when individuals and largely church organisations decided that what this country really needed was schools. Now, some of you will probably disagree with him on that, but we do need good schools. And they were started as non-government bodies, and they supported themselves. Then the government came in, and I guess once you start going back over this story, you can give just a little bit of the credit to the story to different people and organisations along the way. The government came in and started providing aid to those people who initiated the schools, who introduced good schools, or as good as they could get in those days. Remember that a lot of the teachers were convicts, and the children were children of convicts and so on. But they got the show on the road. If it wasn't for them, you wouldn't be here. How's that? Along came government, and government started to intervene. And then you get Henry Parkes, and a lot of people say, no, look, the story really belongs to Henry Parkes. Well, as Barry said, almost everything belongs to Henry Parkes, because I think Henry Parkes was very much like a fellow I once studied, a fellow called George Washington Plunkett, who was a Tammany Hall politician. And he described his politics. He said, my politics is like my religion. It's of an exceeding accommodating character. Well, Sir Henry Parkes was a bit like that. So Henry Parkes, well, he could teach it either way, as they say. I heard somebody discussing non-government schools, and they said, well, should public money go to schools that might teach some aspect of science that we don't agree with? Supposing they're teaching a flat earth policy, for example. And then they told the story of somebody who was being interviewed for the job, and they said, well, do you teach a job as a science teacher? And they said, do you teach that the earth is round or that the earth is flat? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, look, I'm really keen to get this job, and quite frankly, I can teach it either way. And that was a bit like Sir Henry Parkes. He was both for it and against it at different times in his career, and he probably changed his mind several times. He was of an exceeding accommodating character. But he does deserve some of the credit, and he does deserve some of the blame. And we can keep going through there. If we get into this century, we can give some of the credit, and some do. Some give the credit for state aid to Arthur Calwell, who, as a leader of the Labour Party, and when he was a very young man, and we tell the story in the book. He tells it, in fact, in his own book, but his own party doesn't tell the story much for him. He actually went to a national conference of the Labour Party in I think it was about 1912 or 1916 or thereabouts, and he and 12 other people argued for state aid because the schools that he represented were basically the Catholic schools, were in terrible state at the time. They were and declining. Their conditions were declining. And he argued for state aid, got 12 people to support him in that conference. 200 people opposed him and said, don't you talk about that stuff here in a Labour conference, or you're just not going anywhere in your career. Another fellow was along with him, a fellow named Jim Scullin, who you might remember from your history lessons, became Prime Minister of Australia. He said back in those days, he said, look, I'm in favour of state aid, but I'm not going to let my party hear about that, or it's going to wreck my party. It's going to split my party apart, because there was something else. lot of people put the story down to being anti-Catholic or pro-Catholic or anti-Protestant or pro-Protestant or something in either sides of this debate. It was never really like that. There was something much bigger. There was an ideological factor involved in the opposition to state aid, and people never came to grips with it. But poor old Arthur, a good man, deserves some of the credit, but he couldn't stick with it, or if he did, he couldn't rise to the prominence that he did in his party. Scullin, much the same. And on it goes. Throughout the whole story, there are all these little pieces that just tell you a little bit about the elephant. Somebody, I thought, really deserved to tell the whole story and pull all these pieces together, and that's what I've tried to do, and that's what I hope the book does. Eventually, of course, when you're going through all these players in the process, you get to I'm being rained on, I think. You get to Sir Robert Menzies. And he is the person, if there is one person who does deserve some credit, because he saw a real need. Another thing, if you have a quick look at the book, you'll see people keep raising the story about the right to an education and the needs of schools and so on. It was never quite that cut and dried. We got assistance because Sir Robert Menzies looked at it and he said, yes, people have the right, but there is also a great need. And he brought those two aspects of the whole question together. A lot of people said, in fact, I'm already receiving raindrops and keep falling on my head or something. I've already received mail from critics of this book, and I'm sure there'll be a lot, because I do tell some unfortunate stories there that some people will disagree with. But a letter I received just yesterday, or an email, somebody saying, look, Menzies came up with what was good politics but bad policy. I think I probably would take entirely the opposite view, that he might have in fact come up with excellent policy, but he didn't know at the time if it was good or bad politics. It might even have been bad politics, because there were many people to convince him that what he was doing when he first started, when he first offered direct aid, that it was going to cost him more votes than he was going to win. There was certainly no certainty about that. He did it simply because he thought it was right. He thought it was necessary, it was needed, and it was right. So try to keep politics out of it. Except there were a whole lot of people following Menzies, and we're honoured to have one of them with us today in Sir John. But there were people like other Prime Ministers like Gorton and Fraser and McMahon and John Howard more recently, ministers like Sir John, Wal Fife, another federal minister who both in the New South Wales Parliament and in the federal Parliament played a very, very important role in developing aid to non-government schools to allow them to become the fine organisations and make the contributions that they're making today. So Menzies and a team of people who came after him. At the state level, there are other important people too. Barry mentioned Sir Robert Askin, but we also have people like John Madison and Ken McCaw, I think, and Wal Fife. All of these people worked with Sir John in getting people to start thinking, getting even the Liberal Party to start thinking, hey, there is something here that is needed and something here that is right. Now, I'm getting dangerously into the area of politics now, I suppose, once we get up to Menzies and get short of history, and I've tried to present this as a historian. That's a bit of a swing, because, as was said, I'm actually a political scientist, but nobody really knows, including myself, what a political scientist is. And as I'm getting close to politics, I'm going to wind down, because I don't know anything about politics, and I'd rather leave that to the politicians. Which I will do. So I'll close on that. I hope you have a look at the book, and I hope you get something out of it. I hope it figures in your library, and if you don't care to buy it, at least borrow it from the library, you folk. And I'll just wind up by thanking you all very much for being here, and thanks again to the school, Stephen, for making these facilities available to us. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graeme. There's not a great need for me to introduce Sir John, because we've referred to him several times through today, but I'd like to make a couple of points. He was an education minister in the government of Malcolm Fraser. He was Minister for National Development, and he was leader of the government in the Senate. He also conducted the inquiry that Barry referred to into education for the Groiner government in 1988. To me, the distinguishing feature of Sir John and his ilk in politics, and I count Barry and Tony Abbott among them, is that they are people that went into politics to do things. They went into politics with deep values, and they sought power not for the sake of having power, not for the sake of exercising power, but because they wanted to put in place good policy. The distinction that Graeme made between policy and power, policy and politics, is a very important one. He's admired, and he's in the pantheon of liberalism for it, because he achieved great things through combining a deep sense of values, extraordinary political skills, but also a desire to implement policy. It gives me a great honour, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sir John Carrick.
We grow smaller as we grow older. Thank you, Tom Harley. It's a very great privilege to be here amongst my colleagues, but above everything, to be here amongst you students. You may think you've been dragged here because the adult audience needed more people here away from your holidays. I want to tell you this, and I want to tell you with all the sincerity I can, this is not just a book about aid for schools. This is a book, a very precious book, and I commend the Research Centre for it. I commend, of course, the skills and the scholarship of Graham Howard. This is a book about a free society and how you young people have got to pick it up in about 10 years' time and do it a better job. A better job. So it's a book about you. It's a book about saying, if we're going to have a free society, we've got to defend that society, not just in guns and war or anything else, but in values. Look, if education in ordinary information is as nothing unless it adds value to it. The English language is full of values we've drawn from our great writers, our great poets, our Shakespeares, our Bible. They're the things that you've got to keep in your mind. And this book is saying to itself, now, how should a society look at educating human beings? Not just some human beings, but every human being. I was proud, as I think Tom Harley mentioned a moment ago, to help to write into the Education Reform Act. Governments are responsible for the education of every student. The governments are responsible for the education of a high-quality education for every student. Governments are responsible to create diversity and choice, freedom of choice. Now, that has taken a long journey, and you've got to fight to keep it there. You should read this book because it tells you, and Graham has done it with great scholarship, with great political science skills and restraint, to give you something of the warnings of the journey. I want to tell you something that they seem to think that as a nonagenarian I must have learned something. We'll go back to about the 1950s, and I think it was a fellow named Menzies suggested to me that I might go and have a talk with the then Catholic Archbishop of Canberra-Goulburn, Eros O'Brien, a wiser, nicer, gentler, educated man I've never met. And I went to talk to him, unhappy, very unhappy about sectarianism. I'd come from a war where there was no sectarianism. I couldn't understand it at all. And I wanted to talk to him about schools because we had problems. He said something to me that I want to commend to every one of you, because within it is a message for the future which Graham has really put into that book in a beautiful way. He said to me in his inimitable way over a luncheon, he said, the trouble with we tykes, we Catholics, and you bigoted Protestants, old man, is we're remote from each other. If you're walking down the street and you come to a convent and there's some nuns in the yard, hop the fence and talk to them. The old girls will love it. I want to tell you this, I've hopped many fences and I've talked to many people, and I'm so much the better informed, not necessarily the wiser, but so much better the informed, as I'm reminded. Now, what have I learned from that? I want to tell you that that journey took me, with 6 prime ministers who were silly enough to put up with me, took me to look into electorates, which perchance most of them were sub-economic in those days, and see people whose families had come to Australia to escape from poverty and persecution, to look to, and they brought with them their teachers, they brought with them their spiritual leaders, and they, just by accident, were crowded into enclaves which were in fact parishes. And they thought, and they had reason, they thought, to rely upon their trade unions, so they joined the trade unions, and that is good. I have very strong agreement with trade unions when they stick to their industry, and they thought it would be a good idea to belong to the Labour Party. The tragedy of this book is, why was it that that failed? And that's for you to answer. Why was it? There's nothing wrong with trade unions. There's nothing wrong with the Labour Party. But why was there not for 70 years an exposure of what was happening? I felt very sad about that altogether. Now, where are we? We're at a situation where we've proudly come to look at in schools some measure of funding, some measure of bringing together freedom of choice, but we've got a long way to go. Whether or not in the future, as I think has been said, there may be as many or more people in independent schools than government is quite irrelevant to the situation. I am a state schoolboy by education and proud of it. Let me make that clear, and proud of it. And I want the state schools to be raised to the highest quality that we can get. And indeed, there is no quarrel about money, because the more the people move into independent schools, the more the state government's got to spend on its own students. So put aside all those things. What I want to say to you is this. In this book you have a production by a political scientist. Now, you probably come and read television, see television, look at radio and so on, and you get an impression of politics that is something rather dirty, something rather melodramatic, and a symptomatic thing that flashes onto television every day or two, and that it's mostly conspiracy, or somebody running off with somebody else's girlfriend. Who knows? I want to tell you this, that if you value what's going to happen to you in 5-10 years' time and so on, a free society, you are the people who will give the reputation to politics. You are. Nobody else. Nobody else at all. We're all ordinary, simple people. I came from a family in depression and war. I came from a family simply that I think and value had good values. Now that's what we're here for. What you're here for is to make sure that if you don't think that politics is good enough, make it better. Make it better. You've got yourself, and you can do that. Menzies, the reason for the Menzies success was a tremendous thing. There came back from a war a group of people who had been through depression and war, and their families had been through 2 wars and a depression, and they wanted to reform the world. They were the ex-service people that I was proud to associate with. What you've got to do, you've got to keep it burning in your souls. Talk to your friends about it. You have got to make this an even better place. And just as Eris O'Brien said to you, we're remote from each other, we've not only got to be less remote between Anglicans and Catholics, but what about Buddhists, and what about Hindus, and what about Muslims? What about all those people who are seeking to get values? Just remember this. I was unhappy some 20 years ago when I talked to the to then Teachers Federation, and I have an admiration for some of the Teachers Federation, but in this I didn't, when I talked to them about how do we teach values, and they said to me in the 1980s, 1970s, we don't teach values. There is no teaching unless there's values. There is nothing, no value in you coming together, no value in looking at your Googles or whatever you do in getting facts, unless you put with them your understanding of human beings. The art of education is to get understanding about yourself and the world around you. And if I can say it with passion, that's what this book is doing. And you people have got to create in your schools, in your journey through life, what Archbishop O'Brien said, hop the fence, they'll love it. Just get amongst other people, get to understand their values, and you can be that. But above everything, what you've got to do, if you want this to succeed, is to put aside this idea that politics can be something dirty and shabby, put aside the fact that day to day you can get your understanding of politics from some 30-second thing on television or perhaps 40 seconds on radio. Go and learn it. If you want to, join your political parties, join societies that will enrich you. Above everything else, you've got one of the greatest basis of learning. The English language, which I think is about second, if not first, of all the languages in terms of words and things, is one of the richest sources of values in the world. And finally, I conclude with a fellow named John Donne, who 400 years ago said something terribly important, where he put the responsibility on you. He said, no man is an island entirely of itself. Every man is part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. You've got to go out and be involved in mankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir John. I just draw your attention, ladies and gentlemen, to the fact that Sir John was the only speaker not to use notes. I think he was certainly the most lucid, I count myself, and evinced the greatest passion based on his depth of values. Barry, I think you're nearly there. This is the last time you're going to hear from me. I'm here to introduce Julian Leeser, the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. I do the speaking, he does the work, so it's about time he did some speaking.
It's been a great period, actually, just recently for book launches about and by Australian politicians. Last week, I think the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, launched a new book called Jasper and Abby and the Great Australia Day Kerfuffle, aimed at the 3 to 6 year old market. That was his summer holiday activity. Last summer, you'll remember, he wrote a 6,000-word essay on neoliberalism. Can I say, having had a look at both things, there's no greater depth in the new book than there was in the 6,000-word essay. Across town today, we've had the next Premier of New South Wales, Barry O'Farrell, launch what is an extremely important book, Variety and Choice, Good Schools for All Australians. And I think Barry's speech today was terrific and demonstrated that he is a great Liberal in the Menzies tradition. Can I thank Barry, and can I thank Sir John Carrick for what was the most outstanding presentation today of the important values that are contained in this book and the important values that underlie our philosophy as Liberals. Can I thank Graeme Starr for putting up with the vicissitudes of putting a book together and my various thoughts on editing over a long period and so on. This has been a really important contribution to the public debate. And can I finally thank our host, Stephen Harris, and the Northern Beaches Christian School. As students, you may not realise this at the moment, but what your parents have done for you by sending you to a school like this is very important. They've made financial sacrifices because they believe in its values, they believe in the individual attention that you will get, and they believe in the opportunities that you'll get at this school. And we're very fortunate today to be here, and so I thank you, Stephen. Finally, at a book launch there are two traditions. The first is to join us for some refreshments afterwards, but the most important tradition is actually to buy the book. And if you've already bought a book, can I say you should buy 2 or 3 because they make a great back-to-school gift. If you want to find any more information about the centre, please go onto our website www.mrcltd.org.au. Thank you very much for your attendance here this morning.